True Scary Winter Stories. Number 1, Winter Hike. I like to hike in the winter. I know that seems really weird to some people, but it's actually not weird at all to me. There are definitely advantages to hiking in the winter. Mostly, I hate sweating and I almost never sweat when I am hiking in the winter. I mean, there are disadvantages as well. There is a lot of wildlife that you can't see because they are hibernating. Plus, all of the non-pine trees are completely bare. I've been hiking in the winter for an exceptionally long time. I still do it now, despite a really scary experience I once had when I was a teenager. I just don't hike in the area that the experience happened anymore. My parents got divorced when I was pretty young. It was a really congenial divorce, and I went to live with my mom in the city. However, a few times a year, I would go and stay with my dad. The year that this happened, I was on winter break from school. My parents decided it was okay that I spend the entire winter break with my dad. I was ecstatic, really. I mean, my dad, of course, did not get the entire winter off. We spent some time together during the holidays. But of course, he had to go back to work and then I had to find ways to entertain myself. During the first week in January, I decided to go do some exploring. It was rather cold outside, but we really didn't have much snow to speak of. I bundled up as best as I could and left my dad a note in case he got back before I did. I then set out to go see some winter nature. I was having the time of my life for a few hours. I always like seeing creeks when they get frozen. At one point, I actually came across a frozen waterfall. If you have never seen something like that before, I hope you'll get a change too. It was one of the neatest, most beautiful things I had ever seen in my life. I was surprised when snow started to fall, though. At first I wasn't worried much and figured it would just be a few flurries. However, it didn't take long before the snow started falling really hard. I was surprised because there weren't very many times that there was snow at all in this area. And it began sticking and that worried me. I mean, I had hiking boots on but still. The snow began piling up amazingly fast and in a noticeably brief time it would be difficult to walk in. And I was a long way from home. As I trudged through the snow, I once again began getting concerned. It just fell harder and harder and my visibility became impaired. There was no way to orientate myself because everything began to look like nothing but a bunch of white. I was really beginning to get worried, so I began looking for some shelter that I could use to wait out the storm. I was expecting maybe a cave or something. I felt very relieved, however, when I came across an old building. It wasn't huge, like a barn or anything. I guess it was just an old house, although I think it was really weird to get to see such a place out in the middle of nowhere. I tried to open the door and it was pretty solidly shut. I grabbed the handle, put my foot on the building and tried to pull the door open. Finally, I was able to pry it open. I went inside the small home and closed the door. I was positive that the snowstorm would end. The inside of the building was really run down. I imagined that no one had been there for a long time. I thought I'd take the time to go and explore it. I walked into the bedroom and stopped in shock. Laying on the bed was a human being. Or what looked like a human being. It was skinny, its skin was all touch and shallow. It moved a bit when it saw me, and its back was hunched over. If I had to guess, the person looked like it had. In the nastiest, weirdest voice, it told me to get out of its house. Fumbling out of bed, the creature made its way to its dresser where there was a gun rack over it. I wanted to apologize for trespassing, but I didn't want to get shot by a hunchback either. So, I quickly ran out of the room, knowing the decrepit person couldn't follow me. I ran back out in the blizzard. I was still whited out for the most part, but I didn't care. I wanted to get as far away from that strange little house as possible. It took me an exceptionally long time, but I did eventually make it home. I was cold and soaked from the snow, and it took me hours to feel comfortable again. I told my dad about what I saw, and he dismissed it. He said there were some people who lived out in the hills and maybe the person was just malnourished. He told me I should avoid going into buildings when I am out hiking. I definitely will. Number 2, delivery. I haven't had one of these happen in an exceptionally long time. I am not sure if it's because of climate change, but when I was younger, it seems like we used to get much more severe snowstorms than we get nowadays. Hell, when I was a kid, I remember it being common in winter for the snow to get so deep that I would sink down to my chest in it occasionally. But that doesn't seem to happen much nowadays. The year this happened, we had one of the worst snowstorms that I can ever remember. I lived in a third-floor apartment building when I was 19 years old. I had a job working in a video store. So, imagine how long ago this had to have happened. I went to bed around 11 p.m. because I had to leave for work at 8 a.m. However, I was woken up around 6 a.m. by a phone call. It was my boss, telling me that the store was going to be closed. When I asked him why, he told me to look out my window. When I did, I saw that it had snowed pretty heavily overnight. In fact, looking down at the parking lot, I couldn't even see my car. It was completely covered up. My boss told me that it was pretty likely that we might be closed for a couple of days. It was still snowing when he called me, so who knew when it was going to stop? The first day was pretty nice. I just spent some time on AOL, which also should tell you how long ago this happened, talking in chat rooms. But the second day, I began to get a little bit of cabin fever. The plows had been through a few times, but that really didn't help me too much. My car just got covered in more snow. The apartment building had done some shoveling and some salting, but they didn't do anything to get the cars uncovered. Fortunately, the continued snowing must have convinced my boss to not open the next few days, so at least I didn't have to make excuses to not come into work. On the third evening, I was really starting to go a little stir-crazy. I needed something to take my mind off the fact that it had been 3 days since I had been out of my house. I couldn't really go anywhere as most of the town was still closed. However, when I looked online, I noticed something that really surprised me. This Chinese restaurant that I really liked was open and they were delivering. So, I decided to get some food. I ordered the food and then tried to find something to watch for when it arrived. When the delivery guy showed up, I felt a little weird as he gave me the once-over. I mean, how unprofessional is that? I gave him money and a tip. But he questioned the amount of the tip. I found that weird because he wasn't complaining, but he insisted that I gave him too much. I tried explaining the tip to him, but it seemed like he was deliberately not understanding in order to keep talking to me. It took a while, but I was finally able to pull away from the guy. I closed the door and went to eat my food. A noticeably short while later, I heard a knock on the door. Looking out the keyhole, I saw it was the delivery guy again. When I asked if I could help him, he then asked me if he could come in and use my phone. Apparently he needed to call his job because his car was getting trapped in the snow. This seemed very unlikely to me as it wasn't snowing, and he had only been there for a few moments. I offered to let him use my cell phone but told him I wasn't too keen on letting people I didn't know into my apartment. He insisted, telling me it would only be a moment. He didn't like cell phones and told me he thought they caused brain cancer. I told him that was the only option I was giving him. If he wanted, he could knock on someone else's door and see if they would let him in. I could tell he was irritated. He shuffled his feet for a while before walking down the hallway and out of my sight. I thought that was the end of it. About 5 minutes later, however, I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from down the hallway. A few moments later, I heard someone pounding on my door. Shocked and scared, I just grabbed my phone and called 911. I yelled at the man that I was calling the police. He pounded on the door a few more times but then was quiet. When the police came, I finally opened my door and noticed blood on it. Apparently what happened was he tried to get a neighbor of mine to come over and knock on my door, to get it opened. She refused and he attacked her. Fortunately, the woman fought back and injured him enough to get her door closed. That was when he came back and pounded on my door. He never went back to the restaurant. Apparently, he was a new employee and had only been there a week. The police had a record on him. He was on parole from a rape charge he was convicted on. Of course, the Chinese restaurant hadn't done a background check on him or anything, as that wasn't completely common back then. He was picked up and went to jail. Number 3, School Blizzard. I find it really odd how often kids seem to get snow days from school nowadays. The entire time I was in school, I cannot remember getting a snow day even once. Hell, there were times when my mom put me in a snowsuit, and I had to walk to school with the snow all the way up to my waist. School just never got canceled. High school was no different. When I was a sophomore, we had a really nasty blizzard. In fact, it was worse than anything I had ever seen before or since. I was certain that school was going to be closed, but I was wrong. Watching TV for school closings, there were some in other areas that we closed. But all of our schools were open. So, I got ready to go to school and trudge through the snow. Here was the strange part. Although school was not closed, there really were not a lot of students who showed up to school. All of the teachers showed up, though, so they were able to do class. However, since the classrooms were really mostly empty, we didn't do any actual schoolwork. We watched TV in most classes or had reading time. It really made me wonder why they even bothered keeping the school open. It was snowing during school too. I honestly couldn't figure out why it was so difficult for them to cancel the classes and send everyone home. Well, after sitting through 4 classes, I had lunch. At that point, I had decided if 90% of the students didn't come to class that day that I wasn't going to go to my next class. Lunch was a perfect time for me to slip away. I decided to hide out in one of the bathrooms until the next class started. Then, there wouldn't be anyone in the hallway and I could just slip out of school and go home. I went into one of the stalls and I waited until the bell rang. I was supposed to go to trigonometry after this, so I figured it was the perfect class to skip out on. I decided to wait a few minutes after the bell rang to slip out. However, mere moments after the bell rang, I heard the bathroom door open up. I didn't want to get caught by teachers, as that would ruin my chance of getting out of school. So, I pulled my feet up and pretended not to be there. It only took me a few moments to realize that it wasn't a teacher. It was 2 voices, one was obviously a student and the other one was older. Listening to them, I realized that a drug deal was going on in the bathroom. So, I realized that I needed to be as quiet as possible because I definitely did not want to get caught. You know how when you have to be quiet, for some reason, something has to happen that prevents you from being quiet? Well, of course, at the worst moment, I felt a sneeze building in my nose. I did my best to hold it in and I actually succeeded. However, even that caused me to make a noise and one of my feet slipped off the toilet and landed loudly on the floor. It only took a couple of moments for the guys to get the stall door open and to pull me out of the stall. One of the guys pinned me up against the stall door, using his forearm on my neck. The other guy took a knife out of his pocket. They started asking me what I heard, and I really knew better than to tell them nothing. I was scared, but I told them I heard them talking about the drugs, but I really didn't care about it. I had no problem with drugs. I was only hanging out there because I wanted to skip class and go home. They seemed to believe it, but the guy still held me up against the stall. The other took the knife, he held it to my throat and said it would be a big mistake if I told a single person about it. He told me he wouldn't slit my throat, though. He ran the knife down to my crotch and told me, "I'll cut something more important off." I promised up and down I wouldn't tell anyone. And I meant it. The guys let me go then and kicked me as I was leaving. I ran out of the school and went home. It was an awful run, though. I got snow in my shoes and my pants, but I didn't care. I kept my word too. I never told anyone about what I saw. I mean, I was too scared. I didn't even know the younger guy, but I saw him in school all the time. Each time, he gave me a glance that told me I had better keep my mouth shut. School was terrifying for the rest of that year. I don't know if he graduated or dropped out, but he wasn't back the following year. Number 4, Yeller. When I first moved out of my parents' house, which seems like it was so long ago now that I am bringing it up, I went north to Wisconsin. It wasn't much further away, since I was in Illinois, but there is still an incredibly significant feeling in the difference of how cold it is. So, my first winter in Wisconsin was a pretty bad one when it came, and I just had absolutely no idea what to expect. At the time, I was 19 and I didn't go to college. In fact, moved to Wisconsin to be close to a friend and I had to get a job at a retail place. And I would ride the bus to and from work. But walking from the bus to my apartment that winter was hell. I didn't mind it so much when it was snowing, but the freezing cold was a completely different matter. There were times when it was skin-biting. Not having a lot of money, I also didn't live in the best part of town. It was definitely nowhere near as nice as where I grew up. But even though it was not the greatest place to live in, I had a nice long walk from the bus stop and never really had any problem. I don't think there were gangs or anything, I just think it was an extremely poor area economically. Anyway, this was a day in December. It was somewhere around Christmas time. I remember being in the store and it was really slow, so it might have been right after Christmas. It was a long time ago, but I guess it is not important. Point 1. It was snowing pretty hard on this day. I appreciated the fact that I didn't have to drive in it, but I knew I would have to walk through it for a while. It was really heavy snow. And I was at work, waiting to get off work and go home. When it did come around, I went out into the snow and waited for the bus. Visibility was really bad and my bus happened to be a little late. It was going to be terribly slow moving getting home. I noticed something odd as we were getting close to my stop. There was a guy walking along the sidewalk. I could barely make it out, but it looked like he was carrying a gallon jug of iced tea in his hand. And he was yelling stuff while swinging the jug around and around. He looked at the bus when it went by. And he was yelling at the bus, it seemed, but I couldn't make out anything he was talking about. It was not long after that when I got off the bus when we got to my stop. I stepped off into the snow, which I can still feel my feet sinking into the snow. I can still hear that weird crunching sound that it makes when you step into the fresh snow, breaking the surface of the snow. And although there was the howling of the wind in my ears, it only took a few moments before I heard the noise of that guy who was yelling. I quickly looked behind me, back into the falling snow. He was there, I could make him out even though it wasn't the best view. Visibility was still pretty bad. I decided to just walk on ahead and do my best to ignore that guy. I turned onto another street and figured that would be the end of that. I could still hear the guy yelling. I could still not completely understand what he was yelling, but I could absolutely hear him. I turned around instinctively, like you do whenever you hear something behind you. and I noticed that he turned on the street that I was walking on. I was slightly alarmed. I didn't think he was following me. But he was walking a little faster than I was. I didn't want to have to interact with him in any way. He was just too weird. So, I tried to pick up the pace. I had to turn on several streets to get to the house I lived in. It was a house with 2 flats, me living in the bottom one. I turned to another street and gazed back at the guy when I turned. He was still yelling things I could not understand. And I was getting increasingly nervous still. But it was nothing when I noticed that he once again turned on the street that I had turned on. And he was still walking faster than I was. Part of me was convinced now that he was coming after me. I had no idea who he was though, so I doubted he knew me either. But that was of little comfort. Being followed by someone you don't know is much, much scarier. And so, it went on. He turned on all of the streets that I was turning on. And he kept gaining on me while he also kept yelling his strange yelling. But really, it wasn't important. The only important thing at this point was getting into my house, out of the snow and away from this strange yelling guy. So, I kept walking, trying to pick up the pace. I just knew that I would feel better once I got into the house. When I got down the street and closer to my house, I tried picking up the pace and sprinting into my yard. I had that fear that once you start running, you start being chased. But I didn't think about it until I got out of the snow, and into my house, and then I locked the door. I was happy to finally be away from that really weird guy. Before I did anything else, I turned around and looked out of the small window that was in the door. I was shocked when I immediately saw the guy had turned into my yard and was walking up toward the house. He was still shaking that jug of iced tea around and yelling things. It was the realization that I was indeed being followed that was first shocking. I thought it had just been my paranoia. "Hey, open up that door," the man yelled when he got up to my porch. "I need you to open up your door right now." He was shaking that jug of iced tea at the house, which was weird to me. "Hey, I live here, open up that door," he kept yelling. Of course, he didn't live in either flat, but him claiming that he did was just very weird. "Open up that door, I need to get inside." I didn't know how to respond to this. All I knew was this was weird as hell. And I couldn't pretend not to be home. He was behind me when I walked into the house. I didn't know how deranged someone had to be to try and get into your house and claim that they lived there. I told him I was not going to open the door. And when I did, he began pounding on it really hard. He kept yelling at me to open it, and I was getting increasingly scared. "I am going to call the police if you don't get away from my house," I yelled out at the guy. He kept pounding and pushing on the door. He was a big enough guy that I was a bit afraid that he was going to knock it down. I was getting really scared and went over to the phone to call the police. I was worried if they would be able to get there in time. That guy was truly doing a number on the door. And that is when it stopped. But rather than quiet, there was more yelling outside. It sounded like a second person was out there arguing. Running to the window, I noticed that the guy who rented the other flat in the house was out on the porch. He was fighting, arguing with the guy who was trying to get into my place. And it seemed like they knew each other. I heard the yelling, was able to make out a little bit of what they were shouting. I had already called the police, but finally, it seemed like the neighbor chased the guy off. And when he did, I went out and told him about calling the police. I found out that it was a weird coincidence. Before I moved into the flat I was in, my neighbor lived in it with the guy who was following me. I guess the guy got kicked out and my neighbor switched flats. I don't know, it was a long and weird story. Apparently he kicked the guy out for doing bath salts. That gave me a chill, wondering if he had been on them that day. I don't know, but he sure was acting weird. Number 5. 5. Truck. I didn't learn to drive when I was in high school like most people do. I didn't have any interest in it at all. When I got my first apartment, which was in the same town I grew up in, I mostly started taking the bus everywhere. Either that or I walked around in town because that is where I worked. But I got into an argument with my manager and walked out one day. I tried finding a job that I could get to on the bus or within walking distance. The job that I found I could take the bus to most of the time, but at least one day on the weekend when it did not run. So, for a while I was walking and even riding my bike every now and then. For a year or two, this was just how things were. But when I was 22, I decided it was finally time for me to learn how to drive. The one weekend day was murder in the winter when I couldn't ride my bike. It was a 5-mile ride, and in the winter, it snowed so hard that it was difficult to ride the bike 2 and 4. I got my driver's license in the fall, right before any winter storms hit. My parents gave me a little Isuzu truck. Of course, at this point, I quit riding the bus and driving back and forth to work every day. One of the inconvenient things, though, is that now that I was not confined to the times that the bus ran during the week, I was taking on different shifts every now and then. So, a few times I was going home really late at night. So, on the night that this story takes place, I was working one of those late shifts. I probably was not going to get out until after midnight. I was told that there was going to be a snowstorm when I got to work. It made me a bit scared. It would be my first time driving in the snow. And where I lived, the snow could get very, very heavy, especially on the first fall of the year. The snow began falling after sunset. And it was supposed to be very heavy snow. I guess that and the combination of it being the first snow really hurt business that evening. I remember a lot of employees being sent home early because not enough customers were coming into the store. For the last few hours of the whole thing, we didn't even get a single customer into the place at all. I spent a lot of that time in the dining room of the restaurant, looking out the window as the snow kept falling and building up and building up. And the plows were out, but they were barely making a dent into the heavy snowfall that was piling up on the road. Well, then it finally became time to run home. I was feeling really scared. So, I had nothing to expect as far as driving. I don't know much about the truck, but it was such a small truck. And it didn't take a long time until I discovered the fact that it wasn't great for driving in the snow. It kept skidding over and over again, I suppose because it was such a light truck. And it is skidding several times. It took everything I had as a new driver to just keep it on the road. And it didn't work. About halfway home, I had a horrible skid, and the truck went right into a ditch. And the road was pretty abandoned. I put the truck in reverse, got out of the snow, and did all that I could to try and push it back onto the road. I did everything I could but could not get the car out of the ditch. I got very frustrated very quickly. A car or two passed by and they didn't stop to offer me any help. But after some time, someone did finally stop. But it wasn't the most pleasant experience. The guy was kind of scary looking and he told me that he would help me pull the car out of $50. I let him know I didn't have that kind of money to spare, but I thanked him for the offer anyway. Strangely enough, the guy decided to help me for free. It was a bit of a surprise, but not an unpleasant one. After we had the truck out, I thanked the guy. But then he actually told me that I had to pay him the $50 for helping. I told him again that I didn't have that sort of money to spare. And his response made me realize what I had said wrong. You might not have it to spare, but you obviously have it, he told me. You can give it to me, or I can put both your truck and then you into the ditch. I was sort of shocked, but really didn't know how to react. I just told the guy that he misunderstood me, and I didn't have the money. When I did, he walked back over to his truck. I figured he was just going to leave, but what I watched was him reach into the bed of the truck and pull out a tire iron. He then started to walk in my direction. I then jumped into my truck as quickly as I could. This guy was freaking loony. I tried to pull away from him as quickly as I could. He smashed the tire iron up to the side of my truck. As I did my best to skid away, the tire iron caught my driver's side window and smashed it as well. I got hit with shattered glass. The glass was scary, but not nearly as bad as thinking that I might get caught. As I pulled away, he hit the bed of my truck again, but I finally got some traction, and I was able to get away. I thought that the guy might follow me. But if he did, I did not notice. I managed to get to my apartment complex and got into my apartment with no problem. I had to put something over my window to keep it from getting snowed in, but decided to clean the glass up later. I had no way to check on the guy or find out who he was in any way. The positive thing is that I never came across him again. Number 6, trick or treat. Before my parents got divorced, my mom used to always take us out to trick or treat. After the divorce, as my mom didn't have enough money to support us, my dad got custody of me and my older brother. He was always busy working or otherwise feeling sorry for himself, so on Halloween he did not take me and my older brother out trick or treating. And my brother got bored of it much earlier than I did, so after a year, if I wanted to go, I had to go by myself. I am really not complaining, don't get me wrong. I really didn't actually mind going out by myself. But I was pretty young and not really that big of a guy, and I was so depressed after the divorce that I kept to myself. I hadn't made many friends, so I tended to spend a lot of time by myself. Being how I was given a tough time by some of the other kids. I don't want to go as far as saying that I got bullied though. I never really got into fights or really felt threatened by the other kids around me and at school. But I didn't exactly fit in with them or get along with them either. On Halloween of the year this happened, I was 11 years old. My older brother was 14 and I can't exactly remember what he was doing that night. My dad, however, I could tell you was asleep on the couch. He hadn't bought any Halloween candy and was leaving the porch light off so trick-or-treaters would not come up to the house. I always thought that was pretty lousy of him, but not much I can do or say about that now. I live by myself and nowadays, I always buy a lot of tricks-or-treat candy and I tend to give several pieces to every kid who comes to my door. But the absolute weirdest thing ever happened. We were hit by a snowstorm really early in the morning. I had never experienced a snowstorm. And it snowed hard. And they canceled trick or treat for that night. And that was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. Just kidding. I was pretty disappointed about not getting to go out trick or treating. But it was also pretty neat to have such a strong snowstorm so early in the year. I went up to my room and watched television and watched out of the window as the snow fell constantly outside my window. I got up at one point and went to the bathroom. As I was walking back into my room, I saw someone standing in my bedroom. Now, I have my lights off. I was watching somewhat scary things on television. But there was definitely someone in my bedroom and right by my bed. But whoever it was only stood there for a quick moment. They then really quickly crawled under my bed. I stood there for a moment. And at first, I just assumed it was my brother playing a Halloween prank on me. So, I asked him to stop it. But there was no response. So, I asked him to get out from under my bed, but there was no response. The third time I asked, I heard something behind me. "What are you telling me stop doing?" I jumped when I realized my brother was behind me. But I told him that someone was in my room and had gotten under my bed. My brother flipped the light on. He then went over and looked under the bed. But when he got up, he told me that there was no one under my bed. I insisted that there was and assumed he and a friend were playing a prank on me. When I went to look under the bed, I expected him to grab me and scare me. But none of that happened. When I looked under the bed, there was nothing but a few of my toys under there. I swore up and down to my brother, and I swore up and down to you that I did indeed see someone in my room, and I did indeed see them go under my bed. My brother believed me and suggested that it was something called a shadow person. I don't know what it was. I was 100% sure I did see it though. It was scary as hell sleeping on my bed that night. I kept expecting whatever it was to come out.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.